Hey y'all, good morning. It's Michelle with Live Life Whimsically. So I was listening to a true crime podcast the other day, and it reminded me of a story of a woman that was murdered in St. Petersburg when I first moved to Florida. I think like in the mid 80s. I just remember that they did a story in the St. Petersburg Times about her, and it was like an ongoing series. And it really just made me think about how much I um, like to listen to true crime. I'm kind of a weird person like that, and when I go to sleep at night, I like to have that playing in the background, like droning on in my background. But anyway, when I heard about the murder because they were talking about it on this podcast, it made me think of another true crime story that I'm semi connected to in a sort of Kevin Bacon way. My cousin actually lived next door to this person that committed this murder. It was kind of crazy. So, this is the story of Joan Rogers and her daughters, Christy and Michelle, whose bodies were found floating in Tampa Bay. And I think it was 1989. Let me just, yeah, June 4th of 1989. So the murderer's name was Oba Chandler, and he was called Obi and was born in October. Oh my gosh, my cat is walking all over my computer right now. Always. He was born in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1946. He was the fourth of five children, born to Oba Sr. and his wife, Margaret Johnson. He really didn't like going to school, and he thought it was a waste of time even at the young age of like fourth grade, and actually ended up repeating fourth grade because he would skip school all the time. And then in 1957, when he was 10 years old, his father unalived himself in the garage. His sister had found her father's body, and the Oba's family was so distraught about him doing this, they refused to believe that he committed S and blamed his wife at saying that she murdered him. And as a result, the mother, Margaret, did not attend the funeral. And at the funeral, Oba Jr. was so distraught that he actually flung himself into the open grave while they were putting dirt on his father's casket. Some people said it was an attention grab, and I don't know. It just seems that he was 10. He was probably very, very sad. Um, and I would venture to say probably didn't have that great of a life, in my opinion. So he began stealing cars by the age of 14 and was arrested at least 20 times as a juvenile. Um, as an adult, he was charged with a variety of crimes, including possession of counterfeit money, loitering, burglary, kidnapping, and armed robbery. He was also accused of gratifying himself while peeping through a woman's window. In one incident, Chandler and an accomplice broke into a Florida couple's home and held them at gunpoint and robbed them. Chandler told his accomplice to tie up the man with speaker wire and took the woman into the bedroom, where he made her strip down to her underwear and tied her up, and then rubbed the barrel of his revolver across her stomach. Between May and September of 1991, concurrent with the police investigation of the Rogers family triple murder, Chandler was an informant for the U.S. Bureau of Customs in Tampa. Then on May 26, 1989, Joe Rogers, 36, and her daughters Michelle, 17, and Christy, 14, left the family dairy farm in Wilshire, Ohio, for a vacation in Florida. It was the first time they had left their home state. Authorities believe Joan became lost on June 1st during the return drive from Orlando to Wilshire, and had decided to take an extra vacation day in Tampa. And while looking for their hotel, they encountered Chandler, who gave them directions and offered to meet them again later to take them on a sunset cruise of Tampa Bay. Joan and her teenage daughters had left Orlando around 9 a.m. and checked into the Days Inn on Route 60 at 12:30 p.m. Photographs retrieved from a roll of film found in a camera in Rogers' hotel room showed Michelle sitting on the floor. The last photograph was taken from the hotel balcony and showed the sun beginning to set over Tampa Bay, confirming that all three family members were alive and had not left their hotel room as the sunset began. They were last seen alive at the hotel's restaurant around 7:30 p.m. It's believed they boarded Chandler's boat by the dock on the Courtney Campbell Causeway, part of Route 60, between 8:30 p.m. and 9 p.m., and that they were dead by 3 a.m. The next, Chandler may have used the fact that he was born in Ohio to lure them into a feeling of connection to him. I'm sure that that's what happened. I'm sure he said, "Oh, I'm from Ohio too. Let me take you out in my boat." And in the 80s, man, people just kind of went ahead and did all kinds of crazy things. And there was a lot of hitchhiking and stuff still going on down here. I was new to Florida, but I saw a lot of people just getting on boats with people they didn't know and going out into the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of young people like to do that because there was always generally alcohol and other substances available to them. Not always the smartest thing to do. Chandler knew Joan and her daughters were not from Florida because he saw the Ohio license plates on their car. The victims' bodies were found floating in Tampa Bay on June 4th, 1989. The first body was found when several people on board a sailing boat crossing under the Sunshine Skyway saw an object in the water. The second body was seen floating off the pier in St. Petersburg, 2 miles north of the first. While the Coast Guard were recovering the second body, a call about a third, which is floating 200 yards to the east, was received. All 3 female bodies were found floating face down, bound with a rope around the neck and naked below the waist. Autopsy showed all 3 victims had water in their lungs, proving they had been thrown into the water while still alive. Michelle, who was identified as the second body found, had freed one hand from the bonds before she drowned. The partially dressed state of the 3 bodies indicated underlying crime was sexual assault. Ropes with a concrete block at the other end had been tied around the victims' necks to ensure they died from either suffocation or drowning, and that their bodies would never be found. The bodies, however, bloated as a result of decomposition and floated to the surface. The investigation and arrest of Rogers, the Rogers bodies underwent decomposition while underwater due to hot weather. Because of this, they were not identified for weeks after the remains were located. Joan Rogers and her daughter were not positively identified until a week after their bodies discovered, by which time Joan's husband and the girl's father, Hal Rogers, had reported them missing in Ohio. On June 8th, a housekeeper at the Days Inn said the Rogers family room had not been disturbed and the beds had not been slept in. The hotel manager contacted the police. Fingerprints found in the room were a match to the bodies, and final confirmation of the identities came from dental records. Marine researchers at the University of South Florida estimated from currents and patterns that the victims were thrown from a boat and not from a bridge or dry land between 2 and 5 days before they were found. The Rogers car, a 1984 Oldsmobile Calais with Ohio plates, was found by the dock by the Courtney Campbell Causeway. The case remained unsolved for over 3 years, partly due to the volume of tips received by the police investigators. The biggest tip came from a Madeira Beach police bulletin that described a similar rape of a 24-year-old Canadian tourist that occurred 2 weeks before the Rogers murders. Chandler was arrested for the murders on September 4th, 1992. His handwritten directions on a brochure found in the Rogers vehicle and a description of his boat written by Joe Rogers on the brochure were the primary clues that led to him being named a suspect. Local police posted images of Chandler's handwriting on the brochures on billboards in the Tampa Bay area, leading to a call from a former neighbor who provided a copy of a work order Chandler had written. This use of billboards by law enforcement in the U.S. was unusual at that time. Through handwriting analysis, and the 2 samples were matched. A palm print on the brochure was also matched to Chandler, who had sold his boat and left town with his family soon after the billboards appeared. Police reported that Chandler and his then-wife moved from their home on Dalton Avenue in Tampa to Port Orange near Daytona Beach. There were other suspects. Investigators originally thought 2 men were involved in the murders of the Rogers family. This theory was used for an action shown in a 1991 episode of Unsolved Mysteries. This theory was dismissed when Chandler was arrested. No evidence of a second man other than a former prison cellmate claimed that Chandler said another man whose identity the cellmate claimed to know but would not reveal has ever surfaced. The second suspect theory was belied by Chandler's approach of the two Canadian female tourists that he was willing to approach multiple potential targets by himself. Hal Rogers' brother John was also considered a suspect, even though he was serving a prison sentence for the R of a woman at the time of the murders. Police investigating the woman's R allegation found evidence indicating John had also sexually assaulted his daughter Michelle, although charges involving this assault were later dropped because of her reluctance to testify. The St. Petersburg Times said John may have planned the murder during a visit to his parents' property near Tampa a month before the murders. Once the police established John could not have hired a contract killer, did not have accomplices, and could not have known the time of his sister-in-law's and niece's trip, he was dismissed as a suspect. Hal was also considered a suspect because he had posted bail for his brother. He states in an episode of On the Case with Paul Lazan that he posted bail prior to knowing his brother had abused Michelle. Hal later said he had promised the family he would post bail and would not renege on his promise. Investigators from Florida and Ohio also discovered Hal had withdrawn $7,000 from his bank account at the time of the disappearance, which he was able to account for. He planned to use it to look for his wife and daughters before he was notified of their deaths. Investigations proved conclusively Hal had not left Ohio during that period. The assault of Michelle Rogers by her uncle and gossip by local people was one of the reasons for the Florida trip. Joan and her daughters wanted to distance themselves from the incident. At his trial in Clearwater, Florida, Chandler said he met Joan, Michelle, and Christy Rogers and gave them directions, but he never saw them again except in newspaper coverage on billboards. He acknowledged he was in Tampa Bay that night and that police had evidence of 3 ship-to-shore telephone calls made from his boat to his home during that time frame of the murders, but Chandler maintained he was fishing alone. He said he returned home late because his engine would not start, which he attributed to a gas leak. He also said he had called the Florida Marine Patrol and had flagged down a patrol boat, but both were too busy to help. He said he subsequently fixed the line with duct tape and returned safely to shore. There were, however, no records of distress calls from Chandler to either the Coast Guard or the Marine Patrol that night, nor were there any Coast Guard boats on the bay the following morning that could have helped him. According to a boat mechanic who testified for the prosecution, Chandler's explanation of repairing the boat's alleged gas leak was not tenable because the fuel lines in his boat, a Bayliner, were directed upward. A leak would have sprayed fuel into the air rather than into the boat, and the gasoline would have dissolved the adhesive of the duct tape Chandler maintained he had used to repair the leak. Under questioning from Pinellas County Prosecutor Douglas Crowe, Chandler then said he could not remember. A woman named Judy Blair testified that on May 15, 1989, 2 weeks before the Rogers murders, Chandler invited her onto his boat in nearby Madeira Beach for a boat trip on Tampa Bay, AR'd her, and then returned her to shore. Blair had been with her friend Barbara Mottram, who refused Chandler's offer to join them on the boat. Smart woman. After Blair was AR'd, she told the court she returned to her hotel room where Mottram was waiting. Chandler was not charged with this crime. Blair testified during the Chandler's murder trial to help establish his pattern of attack and show the similarities between the two crimes. Blair stated that Chandler, on May 14th, had given his name as Dave Posner or Dave Posno when the three first met at a convenience store in Tampa. He told Blair and Mottram he was in the aluminum siding contracting business, which later helped lead investigators to him. And that was what I had heard about him, was that he was doing aluminum contracting all around the Tampa Bay area, and which is part of the reason why my cousin knew who he was, because he lived 2 doors down, had his truck, and that she saw the aluminum siding and stuff, that he worked with. So it also inspired the name of the investigation, Operation Tin Man. The facial composite produced from Blair's description was posted on the billboards along with the handwriting samples. A former employee of Chandler's testified that he bragged about dating 3 women on the bay on the night of the murders, and that the next morning he arrived by boat and delivered materials for a job and immediately set out again. In an attempt to establish Chandler's whereabouts on that night, investigators found records of several ship-to-shore telephone calls made from his boat to his home between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., which may have been attempts to explain his absence to his wife and to provide himself with an alibi for the time of the murders. Chandler's daughter, Christy May Sue, testified that her father had talked about killing 3 women and that he was afraid of returning to Tampa. A woman who worked as a maid at the Days Inn said she had walked past Chandler on June 1st as she was going to the Rogers room for room service. She said she did not realize the significance of the sighting until Chandler's arrest in 1992. This sighting has never been confirmed. Michelle Rogers' boyfriend and Hal Rogers also gave evidence during the trial. Joan Michelle and Christy Rogers were buried in their hometown on June 13th, 1989, after a funeral service attended by about 300 family members and friends. Numerous police officers were present to keep reporters and television crews out of the church during the service. Chandler was found guilty of the murders and was sentenced to death on November 4th, 1994. He maintained his innocence and continued to pursue legal appeals while on Florida's death row. He admitted to the Madeira Beach incident, but said that the S was consensual and that the victim had changed her mind during the act. Because Chandler had already been sentenced to death for the Rogers murders and because prosecutors did not want to subject Blair to the emotional trauma of a R trial, he was never prosecuted for her R. Union Correctional Institution, where Chandler served his prison sentence. Chandler awaited execution of his sentence at the Union Correctional Facility. Shortly after the trial and conviction, his wife Deborah filed for divorce, and their marriage was dissolved a year later. Chandler was no longer allowed to see his daughter Whitney, and in accordance with his ex-wife's wishes, he was not allowed to see later photographs of her. In July 2008, Chandler was on Florida's short list of executions. Friggin' 2008. He killed these people in 1989. Profiling experts speculated Chandler may have killed previously based on the belief that a first-time killer would not be experienced or bold enough to abduct and kill 3 women at once. Chandler remained a suspect in the 1982 murder of a woman whose body was found floating off Anna Maria Island until 2011, when the body was identified as 29-year-old Amy Hurst, and her husband was arrested and charged with her murder. Chandler was never charged with another murder. All of his appeals of his 1994 conviction were denied. His last was in May of 2007. After his conviction, Chandler was named by media as one of Florida's most notorious criminals. He said his last words before his execution would be, "Kiss my rosy red ass." In May 2011, comparisons were drawn between Chandler's case and trial in 1994 and the case of Kaylee Anthony. In both cases, heightened media attention forced the selection of jurors who lived outside of the county where the crime had been committed. One of the jurors in Chandler's 1994 trial said he scared some of the jurors when he would sit there and stare at you and have the stupid grin on his face. He would make your skin crawl. Judge Susan F. Schaefer, who presided over the 1994 trial and ultimately sentenced Chandler, described him in a 2011 interview as a man with no soul. She said it's the worst case as far as factually and as far as a defendant without saving grace that I've ever handled. And I represented plenty of people who were not necessarily good people. On October 10th, 2011, Governor Rick Scott signed Chandler's death warrant. His execution was set for November 15th, 2011 at 4 p.m. His lawyer, Baya Harrison, said Chandler asked him not to file any frivolous appeals to keep him alive. Harrison said, "He's not putting a lot of pressure on me to go running around at the end to find some magic ways out. He's not going to make a scene. He's not going to bemoan the legal system. What he told me was this: if there is some legal way that I can find to try to prevent him from being executed, he would like me to do what I reasonably can." Harrison also said Chandler suffered from high blood pressure, coronary artery disease, and problems with his kidneys and arthritis. On October 12th, 2011, Harrison said although he was preparing to file a motion regarding the violation of his client's Fifth and 14th Amendment rights in the case, he was unsure whether Chandler was willing to travel to Clearwater for the court hearing or would agree to the filing of the motion. He hates coming down to Clearwater. He doesn't like the ride, and he's not well, Harrison said. On October 18th, Harrison filed a motion against the execution on grounds that the way Florida imposes the death penalty is unconstitutional. A jury may recommend a life sentence or a death sentence, but under Florida law, the judge makes the final decision. A hearing on Chandler's motion was set for October 21st at 1 p.m. Chandler did not attend. On October 24th, Chandler's appeal was rejected because he had already filed an appeal to the Florida Supreme Court prior to the decision. Although the Florida Supreme Court initially scheduled Chandler's appeal to be heard on November 9, 2011, they later canceled oral argument. On November 7, 2011, the Florida Supreme Court denied Chandler's appeal of his death sentences and death warrant. The Florida Supreme Court had upheld Chandler's sentence in 1997 and 2003. Chandler's subsequent petition to the United States Supreme Court was also denied. On November 15th, Chandler at 4:08 p.m. was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. Much nicer than what he did to those women. Chandler declined to make a last statement and before being executed, but left a written statement with prison officials. "You are killing an innocent man today." Shortly after signing Chandler's death warrant, Governor Scott said, "Chandler killed 3 women, so I looked through different cases and it made sense to do that one. There's never one thing. It was the right case." Chandler's daughter, Valerie Troxell, said in an interview after the execution, "I believe they did execute an innocent man. I don't think my father alone could have pulled off such a heinous crime. It would have to have been more than one person. The palm print would prove he did meet them and gave them directions, but it didn't mean he killed them. I think the prosecution had a very weak case." Troxell also said she had sent a letter to Governor Scott asking him to commute Chandler's sentence to life imprisonment. Chandler's son Jeff said, "I truly believe he was tried and convicted by the media long before he went to trial. The media can pretty much convict you. I don't think he got a fair trial." After his execution, Chandler was described as the loneliest man in the loneliest place on earth, death row. He did not receive a single visitor during his years in Florida's death row. Another of Chandler's daughters, Suzette, said her father was a monster who got what he deserved. On February 25th, 2014, investigators revealed that DNA evidence identified Chandler as the murderer of 20-year-old Ivelisse Barrios Borghese, who was arred and strangled in Coral Springs, Florida on November 27th, 1990. Barrios Borghese, a 20-year-old newlywed, was last seen at Sawgrass Mills, where she worked at a sporting goods store. When she did not return home, her husband went to the mall and found her car, a 1985 Ford Tempo, with the tires slashed. It is believed Chandler was watching the victim for 2 days, slashed the tires, arrived in the guise of a helpful stranger, and offered to help. 3 hours after she was reported missing, her body was found under a residential mailbox in a local neighborhood by 2 men returning from a fishing trip. Barrios Borghese's body was naked and had ligature marks on both wrists and legs and brown duct tape stuck to her hair. This case is considered solved and closed according to law enforcement across Florida that investigated other cold cases in areas Chandler was known to have resided in. The Discovery Channel devoted a 1-hour episode of its series Scene of the Crime titled The Tin Man to the murders of the Rogers family in 1997. A series of articles titled Angels and Demons, written by Thomas French, which told the story of the murders, the capture and conviction of Chandler, and the impact of the crimes on the Rogers family and their community in Ohio, was published in the St. Petersburg Times. The series won a 1998 Pulitzer Prize for feature writing. The Rogers murders were featured in a 1991 episode of Unsolved Mysteries, which speculated that there were 2 attackers. The 2000 book Bodies in the Bay by Mason Ramsey is a fictional adaptation of the Chandler case. Author Don Davis in 2007 published the book Death of a Cruise, covering the murders. The case was featured in a 1999 episode of Cold Case Files on A&E titled Bodies in the Bay, which also focused on the evidence in the case. In 1995, Chandler, some members of his family, and Hal Rogers appeared in an episode of The Maury Povich Show featuring the case. Chandler appeared via satellite link. Chandler's case was featured in a full-hour episode of Crime Stories. The case was shown on an episode of Forensic Files titled Waterlogged, and in December of 2010 and 2012 investigation, Discovery shows On the Case with Paul Zahn aired 2 episodes called Murder at Sunset, covering the case. In August 2014, the ID series Murder in Paradise covered the case. On February 11th, 2022, the Oxygen Channel aired an episode of Family Massacre called The Rogers Family. And on November 19th, 2022, the true crime podcast Case File detained the case of Joe and Michelle Christie Rogers in their 232nd episode. So what do you think? Do you think that this guy was unfairly treated, or do you think that he actually killed this family? I'm pretty sure he did it, in my opinion. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I think I might do more of these. There's other really cool cases that happened in the state of Florida, and I would love to talk about them, especially maybe some cold cases on missing and murdered Black and brown women, because I feel like they get less attention than other people do. All right, have a good day. I'll come back later and do the tarot card. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment, like, share, all this stuff. See ya.